By increasing your fat intake, not only are you suppressing your blood glucose levels, you're dramatically increasing the amount of saturated fat that accumulates inside of your muscle tissue and inside of your liver. And this causes insulin resistance in the two locations that can become very problematic into the future.
So, you've been told that carbohydrates cause insulin resistance, and you've also been told that dietary fat causes insulin resistance. The answer is both cause insulin resistance, but the problem is excessive weight gain, not the consumption of dietary fat or dietary carbohydrates. Insulin resistance is the hallmark feature of diabetes. This occurs when the hormone insulin produced by the pancreas is no longer sufficient to bring our blood glucose levels back to normal. After a meal, we get a rise in blood glucose. Insulin is then produced by the pancreas, and it binds to a receptor on the cells and causes a little signaling process inside the cell, which eventually allows little channels that are stored inside of our cells, called GLUT4 channels, to bind to the membrane and allow glucose from the bloodstream to enter into the cell. And this glucose can be used as energy, converted into fat, or converted into glycogen. And glycogen is just how we store carbohydrates in the muscle. But when we exceed the amount of glycogen we can store, the excess glucose will simply be turned into fat. The same thing can occur when we consume fat. However, it's non-insulin dependent, meaning these fatty acids can actually get into our cells without the use of insulin. But insulin does increase the uptake of fats. And these fatty acids can also be used as energy. And in the same way that glucose is turned into fat when we have excess fatty acids are already fat, so they'll simply just be stored. And this can occur in the liver, the muscles, the fat tissue, and other cells in our body. Fat can actually be stored inside of the muscle as a fuel source. And at normal levels, this is actually healthy. This is referred to as intramuscular fat. And interestingly, an adaptation to exercise is actually an increased capacity to store intramuscular fat. However, we store this fat safely away from all of the different proteins in our cell. The same thing technically occurs when we develop diabetes. We have an increased storage of intramuscular fat. However, the problem is this fat is actually floating around and can bind to some of the different proteins inside of the cell, specifically the proteins involved in insulin signaling. As you can tell, there's a lot of different proteins involved in insulin signaling. And this right here is referred to as a ceramide. A ceramide is actually a breakdown of fatty acids that does appear to have this effect on disrupting insulin signaling. And this occurs when there's a buildup of fat inside of our cells, specifically in the muscle and the liver. Thus, insulin can bind to the receptor, but it can no longer send the correct signal. Therefore, the cells actually perceive that there is no insulin in the environment, so they won't do the vital processes that insulin stimulate, such as glucose and amino acid uptake from the bloodstream, and fatty acids to a small degree, and the storage of glycogen, the synthesis of muscle proteins, and the storage of fat. Additionally, insulin actually inhibits the breakdown of fatty acids and glycogen, meaning that when this is disrupted, we'll be breaking down fat and glycogen at the same time we're synthesizing it, and we'll be emitting it into the bloodstream, meaning that our blood glucose and blood triglycerides will stay elevated. Because again, the job of insulin is to remove these from the bloodstream. But when we're simultaneously releasing them into the bloodstream, our levels will stay elevated. Additionally, insulin works on the liver to actually decrease what's called glycogenolysis. And glycogenolysis is when the liver will actually break down the storage form of glucose, called glycogen, and release glucose into the bloodstream, which elevates blood glucose levels further. Again, insulin will inhibit this, but when there's improper insulin signaling, the liver will continue this process, again increasing the blood glucose levels when we should be trying to bring them down. And yes, this does occur when there is excessive fatty acid storage inside of the muscle and the liver. And this can also occur in other tissues such as the pancreas and the kidneys. And this is where the negative ramifications of diabetes comes in. Extremely high blood glucose can have very detrimental effects to our bloodstream, our blood vessels, and a lot of our organs. And extremely high blood triglycerides can actually cause atherosclerosis. And extremely high blood triglycerides can contribute to clogging of the arteries. Moreover, if we can't actually properly signal insulin, insulin is very anabolic, specifically for protein. Therefore, we will have declining muscle mass because we do not have a strong signal from insulin for protein synthesis. But the point of this video is that this individual advocates for a low-fat diet. Because yes, fatty acids can inhibit insulin signaling. However, this is not a result of fat intake, rather it's a result of excessive caloric intake. We can overeat on carbohydrates and cause the same buildup of fat inside of our cells. But it's very difficult to overeat on a single macronutrient, such as fat or carbohydrates, which is why a low-fat diet or a low-carbohydrate diet allows a lot of people to reverse insulin resistance. This is simply because they eat less and begin to lose weight. Additionally, it does appear that when we combine both glucose and fat, we are at a greater risk of storing intramuscular fat than we would be if we only had one of the macronutrients. And the reason for this is something referred to as the Randle cycle. And the effect of the Randle cycle is extremely minute, and if you're in a caloric deficit, should not even come across your mind. But if you are in a caloric surplus, you may become insulin resistant a little bit quicker if all of your meals contain a very high amount of fat and carbohydrates. So this is the Randle cycle. And I understand this may look confusing, so let me explain. The Randle cycle postulates that the cell will only use one energy source at a time, and it will use it in according to what is in the highest ratio, either carbohydrate or fatty acids. And when the cell is using fatty acids for fuel, it will inhibit the use of glucose. And this excess glucose can be diverted towards fat storage. And the same thing occurs on the other end. If we eat more carbohydrates than fat, then the excess fat will also be diverted towards fat storage. And this can increase the amount of intramuscular or intrahepatic, meaning inside of the liver, fat that we are storing. And the reason I say this isn't as important in a caloric deficit is because eventually you will burn off the glucose and then you'll turn to these fat stores. So the amount of time that this fat accumulates inside of the cell is very small and eventually is burned off. However, if we're in a caloric surplus, this fat will be deposited and has a greater potential to be formed into these ceramides, which do cause the issues with insulin resistance. So in essence, I'm just trying to tell you that people will tell you that it's one macronutrient or the other macronutrient. And they usually tell you this to sell some sort of program. Specifically, in this individual's case, their entire program is based around a low-fat diet. And an individual trying to sell you a keto diet will tell you that it's carbohydrates that cause insulin resistance. Again, to promote their diet. And they're both correct and they're both wrong at the exact same time. But if you want to get away from dogmatic diets and actually learn the truth, send me a DM and we'll set up a consultation.